The slow, rhythmic drip of water echoed in the cramped darkness beneath the old bathroom sink, a sound that had repeated for decades, heard by no one. Then came the scrape of a steel wrench against corroded brass, the grunt of a man on his knees, and a sudden, sharp clink that cut through the stillness like a whisper from the grave. Plumber Artie Kowalski froze, his thick fingers reaching into the slimy trap of the drain. He pulled out a tangled clump of hair and sediment, and nestled within it a gold wedding band, dulled to a mournful gray. He rubbed it against his flannel sleeve, and beneath the grime, an inscription emerged, delicate and damning, a date and two sets of initials that had been waiting in the dark for 32 years. That was a moment, a Connecticut cold case, long abandoned to dust and memory, cracked wide open, and the first tremor of a shockwave began its roll through a community that had almost forgotten the name Regina Donnet. Before we dive deep into the story, please consider subscribing to Calis-Crime Vault if you've not. It's much appreciated, and keep similar solved cold case stories coming your way. The small, tight-knit community of Essex, Connecticut, in the autumn of 1986 was a place where the leaves on the sugar maples turned the color of burnt copper, and the air smelled of wood smoke and the distant salt of the Connecticut River. It was a kind of town where people still left their doors unlocked, where the high school football game was the axis of the week, and where violent crime was something that happened in distant cities, not on the quiet, lamplit lanes that wound down toward the marinas. On the evening of October 14th, a Tuesday, a chill rain had begun to fall, drumming a soft, insistent rhythm on the slate roofs of the historic district. Regina Donnet, a 34-year-old real estate agent and mother to a 7-year-old boy named Joshua, kissed her son goodnight at her sister's house and climbed into her navy blue Oldsmobile. She was meeting a prospective buyer for a final showing of a grand Victorian on River Road, a property that had lingered on the market, its elderly owners wintering in Florida. She was a woman known for her quick laugh and her tenacity, a divorcee rebuilding her life one commission at a time. When she did not return home that night, and her sister's calls went unanswered, a creeping unease began to spread through the family. By dawn, the Essex Police Department had located her car. It was parked in the gravel turnout at the end of River Road, near the old ferry landing, its doors locked, her purse resting on the passenger seat with $43 still tucked inside, her sails, keys, in the ignition. The river, broad and gray under the overcast sky, offered nothing but the slap of water against the pilings. A search of the Victorian on River Road revealed a home that was eerily immaculate. The staging furniture sat undisturbed, brochures fanned on the kitchen counter, and the door key was found in the lockbox, its code untampered. But in the upstairs bathroom, an oddity presented itself. The pedestal sink and the tile floor around it smelled faintly of bleach, a sharp, clinical scent that cut through the must of an old, unlived-in house. The drain stopper was missing, and the trap beneath, had anyone thought to dismantle it, held a secret that would wait a generation to be told. At the time, investigators dusted for prints, swabbed for residue, and found nothing of immediate consequence. The case fell under the jurisdiction of the Connecticut State Police Major Crime Squad, and the lead investigator was a man named Arthur Pendleton, a methodical, square-jawed detective with a reputation for quiet persistence. The discovery that shattered the quiet of the county came 2 days later. A fisherman casting for striped bass near the mouth of the Lieutenant River spotted something pale and ghostly tangled in the reeds. It was the body of Regina Donnet. She was fully clothed in the same gray wool skirt and cream blouse she had worn to her showing, but her face was marred by the telltale petechiae of strangulation, and around her throat, knotted with a terrible practiced precision, was a silk scarf of a distinctive emerald and gold paisley pattern. The medical examiner determined she had been dead for approximately 48 hours, placing her time of death squarely within the window of that missed real estate appointment. There was no evidence of sexual assault. The motive on its surface seemed either deeply personal or chillingly random. The silk scarf became the first and most maddening piece of the puzzle. It was traced to an exclusive boutique in New Haven, where records showed it was part of a limited run of imported Italian scarves, sold to over 24 customers, most of whom paid in cash. The investigation in its early frantic days seemed to have nowhere to settle its weight. Pendleton and his team began to build a fragile framework of witnesses. A neighbor walking his spaniel reported seeing a man in a trench coat standing under the porte cochere of the Victorian at approximately 7:15 that evening, his face obscured by the rain and the brim of a hat. Another witness, a teenager parked with his girlfriend at the ferry landing, recalled a dark sedan, perhaps a Lincoln, pulling away from the turnout at a high rate of speed, its tires spitting gravel. The most significant lead came from the real estate agency itself. The appointment for the River Road showing had been booked by a man who identified himself as Thomas Carver, a name that immediately caused a stir. Thomas Carver was not a stranger in the Connecticut River Valley. He was a 39-year-old real estate developer, a man of substantial wealth and influence, married to a woman named Margaret Carver, a socialite known for her charity galas and impeccable breeding. The Carvers lived in a restored 18th century manor in Old Lyme, just a short drive across the river from Essex. When Pendleton first sat down with Thomas Carver in the walnut panel study of his home, he found a man of polished composure and a cool, condescending gaze. Carver's statement was clear, repeated without a tremor of variation. He had indeed called the agency to inquire about the Victorian on River Road, intrigued by its potential as a renovation project. He had scheduled the evening showing with Mrs. Donnet. However, he claimed a last-minute emergency meeting with a Boston investment group had forced him to cancel. He stated that he had left a message on Mrs. Donnet's office answering machine that afternoon, informing her of the cancellation. When pressed on why he had not simply called her directly at the office, he explained that he had been in and out of meetings all day and had only a moment to dial the main number. The agency, unfortunately, had no record of that message, and its answering machine logbooks were in 1986 a matter of hastily scrawled pink notes, many of which were misplaced. Carver's alibi for the evening of October 14th placed him at a well-attended business dinner at the Goodwin Hotel in Hartford, a drive of roughly 50 minutes from Essex. His wife, Margaret, corroborated his story with a cool, unwavering certainty. She described their evening in Hartford in meticulous detail. The salmon served at the dinner, the name of the investor seated to her husband's left. Pendleton felt, in the pit of his stomach, a profound unease. Every detail felt too precise, too rehearsed, a suit of armor polished to a high sheen. Yet there was no physical evidence to place Thomas Carver at the scene, and the alibi, while suspiciously robust, was difficult to crack. Rumors, however, are a currency that needs no proof to circulate. Within weeks, the quiet scandal of the town began to whisper of a secret liaison. Waitresses at a local and recalled seeing Regina Donnet in the company of a tall, well-dressed man who was not her ex-husband. A teller at the Essex Savings Bank noted that Regina had made a large cash deposit in August, a sum that seemed beyond the reach of her commissions. The talk, never spoken above a hush, was that Thomas Carver and the vivacious real estate agent had been entangled in a passionate and dangerous affair, and that her final night was the night she had demanded something he could not give. Detective Pendleton, retiring in 1999, carried the weight of the Donnet case like a stone in his chest. He had followed the thread of the affair as far as he could, without a confession. He found a former secretary from Carver's development firm who admitted, under promise of anonymity, that Regina had called the office repeatedly in the weeks before her death, sometimes sounding distressed. He found a dockmaster who thought he saw a Lincoln Continental parked at a secluded boat launch across the river on the night of the murder. But every lead withered under the glare of insufficient evidence. The DNA technology of the era was in its infancy, and the minute samples from a scarf in the house, carefully preserved in the State Crime Lab's evidence vault, could offer no definitive answers. The case file grew thick with supposition, then thin with the passage of time, until it was finally boxed and shelved in a climate-controlled archive. Its dust a testament to a killer's luck. The town of Essex slowly turned the page. The Victorian on River Road was sold, resold, and eventually renovated into a charming bed and breakfast. Its tragic history sanitized by fresh coats of paint and cheerful floral wallpaper. Regina's son, Joshua, grew up in the care of his aunt, haunted by a loss he could not articulate, carrying a mother's photograph in his wallet that grew softer and more creased with every passing year. Then came the autumn of 2018, and the wrench of a plumber named Artie Kowalski. The new owners of the old Victorian, a young couple named Henderson, had decided to gut the outdated upstairs bathroom. The house had settled into a new life, but its plumbing was original, a labyrinth of iron and lead that Artie, a third-generation tradesman from Deep River, approached with the weary expertise of a man who had seen everything pipes could hide. He had removed the ancient pedestal sink and was wrestling with the rusted bolts of the P-trap when his wrench slipped and his knuckles scraped the cast iron. Cursing under his breath, he reached into the trap and pulled out a mass of desiccated, dark material that crumbled in his fingers, hair and sludge that had petrified over decades. And then his fingers closed around the hard, perfect circle of the ring. He washed it in the utility sink, letting the water clear away the black sediment. And as the gold began to gleam faintly, he squinted at the engraving running along the inside curve. It read in elegant flowing script, TC and MC June 12, 1982. Artie's hands began to tremble. He was a local man. He remembered the name Regina Donna from his mother's hushed conversations years ago. He set the ring carefully on a paper towel, dried his hands on his jeans, and picked up his phone to call the Essex Police Department. The ring landed on the desk of Detective Sarah Harlow, a sharp-eyed, no-nonsense investigator who had recently been assigned to the state's newly revitalized cold case unit. When she opened the brittle, yellowing box of the Donna file and began to read Pendleton's meticulous, frustrated notes, she felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature of the evidence room. She contacted the retired detective, now a widower living in a small cottage in Niantic, and the tremor in Pendleton's voice when she read him the inscription told her everything she needed to know. The initials and date were beyond coincidence. June 12, 1982, was the wedding date of Thomas and Margaret Carver, a matter of public record. The ring was a man's band sized for a larger finger, and its existence in that drain trap, untouched since before the murder, constituted a silent, 32-year-old scream from the past. The forensic laboratory in Meriden subjected the ring to a battery of tests that were the stuff of science fiction in 1986. Laser scanning revealed the microscopic traces of a DNA profile, a few sloughed-off skin cells that had been trapped and preserved by the very corrosion that had locked the ring in place. The DNA was a match for Thomas Carver. But the second discovery was what sent a jolt through the entire prosecution team. Lodged beneath the gold setting, nearly invisible to the naked eye, was a single crimson silk fiber. Its dye composition chemically identical to the emerald and gold paisley scarf that had been tied around Regina Donnett's throat. An eerie silence fell over the county on the morning of Thomas Carver's arrest. At 76, he was a stooped but still imposing figure, a philanthropist who had donated a wing to the local hospital, a grandfather whose face graced a program at charity golf tournaments. He was taken into custody at his waterfront estate in Old Lyme, the handcuffs clicking shut on his wrists as a cold wind blew off Long Island Sound. In the back of the police cruiser, he said nothing, his expression a mask of icy contempt. But the investigation was not yet finished with its revelations. The seismic twist that would forever alter the narrative of the case came not from a laboratory, but from the grave. A retired officer who had worked the original crime scene in 1986, a man in his 80s named Gerald Finch, came forward to Detective Harlow with a manila envelope he had held in secret for over a decade. Inside was a microcassette tape and a signed, notarized statement from Margaret Carver, recorded in 2005, just weeks before her death from ovarian cancer. Finch, who had been a close family friend of the Carver's housekeeper, had been entrusted with the tape by Margaret on her deathbed, with instructions that it was to be released only if her husband were ever to be caught. He had carried its weight, a terrible secret of conscience, waiting for a day he never truly believed would come. Harlow, in the quiet of her office, slid the cassette into a player. The voice that crackled through the speaker was thin and ravaged by illness, but its clarity was absolute. Margaret Carver confessed that on the night of October 14, 1986, her husband had returned to their old Lyme home well after midnight, disheveled, his trench coat spattered with mud, his hands shaking violently. The skin of his knuckles was raw and scratched. He had told her in a panic that the Donnet woman had lured him to the Victorian under the pretense of a showing, that she had threatened to expose their affair and destroy his marriage and his business reputation, and that when he had tried to leave, she had clawed at him, and in the struggle, he had used her own scarf to silence her forever. He had dragged her body down the back staircase and into the trunk of his car, and he had spent an hour bleaching the bathroom where the final, fatal moment had occurred. In his haste, he had not realized that his wedding ring, always a bit loose in the colder months, had slipped from his finger and vanished down the drain. He had told Margaret he searched frantically, but the water had already washed it deep into the trap. The wife, bound by a marriage of power and dependence, had helped him clean the Lincoln that night, burning the rags in their great stone fireplace. She had been his alibi, his shield, and the keeper of his secret for 19 years, a secret that had poisoned her final days with its corrosive guilt. It was at this juncture, as the weight of this long-buried confession settled over the investigation like a shroud, that a brief but important interlude occurred. The story you are hearing, a narrative of hidden truths and delayed justice, is one of many that find their voice on this channel. To ensure you remain a part of this unfolding journey into the darkest corners of the American landscape, we cordially invite you to subscribe and to turn on closed captions for the best possible experience, allowing every whispered detail to reach you with perfect clarity. Now we return to the final, fateful chapter in the case of Regina Donnet. The arrest of Thomas Carver and the unsealing of his late wife's deathbed confession ignited a firestorm that consumed the placid communities of the lower Connecticut River Valley. The courtroom in Middletown became a theater of high drama, its benches packed with journalists, true crime aficionados, and townspeople who had lived for decades in the shadow of a lie. Thomas Carver wheeled into court with a blanket over his lap and a defiance set to his jaw, pleaded not guilty by reason of dementia, a claim swiftly dismantled by a parade of psychiatric experts who found his mental faculties to be as sharp and calculating as ever. The prosecution, led by a tenacious state's attorney named Diane Lockhart, presented a case that was a masterclass in the weaving of old evidence and new science. The silk fiber from the ring was placed beside the murder weapon scarf, their union under a microscope, a visual thunderclap for the jury. The DNA from the ring's inner band was projected on a large screen, its statistical certainty a cold, mathematical finger pointing directly at the defendant. But it was the spectral voice of Margaret Carver, echoing from the microcassette, that transformed the trial into something deeply unsettling. The recording was played in full. The jurors leaned forward, their faces pale, listening to the halting, morphine-thin confession of a woman who had chosen to protect a monster out of a twisted loyalty and a terror of scandal. The defense argued it was the fantasy of a dying, delusional woman, but Gerald Finch, the retired officer, took the stand with a quiet dignity that was unshakable. He described the trembling hands of the housekeeper who had smuggled him the tape, the absolute sincerity of Margaret's terror that her husband would discover what she had done. The most searing moment of the trial arrived when Joshua Donnet, now a 39-year-old architect with a family of his own, took the witness stand. He did not speak of revenge. He spoke with a voice that cracked but never broke, of a mother who used to sing Joni Mitchell songs in the car, who had taught him to skip stones on the river, and who had missed every single milestone of his life because of the man who sat cold and silent just 20 feet away. There was not a dry eye in the gallery. The defense attempted to paint Regina Donnet as a woman of loose morals, a gold digger who had ensnared a wealthy man and then threatened his family. It was a strategy that backfired catastrophically. The old rumors once whispered in the country club lounges now seemed tawdry and mean-spirited when aired under the harsh light of an impartial court. Witnesses who had kept silent for decades finally came forward. A former maid from the Carver household testified that she had found a woman's earring, a cheap but distinctive enamel flower, in the pocket of Mr. Carver's suit jacket a week after the murder, an earring she later saw in a photograph of Regina Donnet shown on the local news. A retired dockmaster, his health failing but his mind sharp, swore he had not only seen the Lincoln Continental on the night of the murder, but had watched a man of Carver's build laboriously haul something heavy from the trunk toward a small skiff, a skiff that was never seen in that mooring again. The accumulated weight of these truths, small and large, crushed the presumption of innocence. After 6 hours of deliberation, the jury returned a verdict of guilty of murder in the second degree. The courtroom, which had been holding its collective breath, released a sound that was part gasp, part sob. Thomas Carver, his face ashen, was sentenced to 20 years in the Connecticut Department of Correction, a sentence that effectively meant he would die inside the cold stone walls of the prison. As he was led away in chains, he paused and turned his head, his eyes scanning the gallery until they found the face of Joshua Donnet. The look that passed between the killer and the son of his victim was not one of remorse, but of a chilling, hollow emptiness, a final confirmation of the void that had allowed him to strangle a woman and then attend a charity luncheon the following week as if the world were unchanged. Outside the courthouse, a press of reporters gathered around Arthur Pendleton, the retired detective whose dogged work had laid the foundation. The old man, his eyes glistening, simply said, "I just wish your boy hadn't had to wait so long to hear the word guilty." The resolution of the case brought a measure of peace to Essex, a quiet, somber closure that settled over the town like the first snow of winter. A memorial bench was dedicated to Regina Donnet in the park overlooking the river she had so loved, and her son Joshua sat there for a long while on the day of the sentencing, tracing the letters of her name with his finger. The story of the wedding ring in the drain became a staple of true crime lore, a chilling reminder that some houses hold their secrets in the very walls and pipes, waiting for the right moment to speak. The tension that had gripped the community for 3 decades began to ease, replaced by a reflective melancholy. But there was an epilogue to this history that was not made public at the trial, a detail that Detective Sarah Harlow kept locked in her desk drawer, and that would only surface long after the cameras had left the courthouse steps. 3 weeks after Thomas Carver was remanded to prison, Harlow received a plain white envelope with no return address, postmarked from a town in the northwest hills of Connecticut. Inside was a single sheet of paper and a small rusted key. The handwritten note was brief and spidery, the penmanship of a very old or very infirm hand. It read, "The ring in the drain was not the first. If you want to know what happened to the others, the key opens a safe deposit box at the First National Bank of Litchfield. Ask for the box under the name of a ghost." Harlow felt a cold fist close around her heart. She made the drive through the rolling, leaf-strewn Litchfield hills in a state of heightened alertness. At the bank, the key led her to a narrow tin box. Inside, resting on a bed of yellowed velvet, were 3 more wedding rings. Each was tarnished, and each bore a set of engraved initials and dates that did not match those of Thomas and Margaret Carver. And underneath the rings, neatly folded, was a map of Connecticut with 3 small, faded red XS marked in the remote corners of 3 different counties. The ghost of the past had just whispered a far darker and more terrible story, one that Detective Harlow knew was only just beginning. The car radio crackled with the mundane dispatches of a quiet afternoon as she sat alone in the parking lot, staring at the rings in her palm. And she understood with a creeping dread that the mystery of the wedding ring in the drain was not an ending at all, but a door that had just swung wide open onto a long, dark, and terrible hallway. The heavy steel door of the safe deposit vault swung shut with a sound like a tomb ceiling, and in the fluorescent hush of the little viewing room, Detective Sarah Harlow lifted the lid of a long tin box. What she saw inside stopped her heart for a full 3 beats. 3 wedding bands, each one tarnished to a dusky charcoal, rested on a cushion of faded velvet, and beneath them, a map of Connecticut unfolded like an accusation. 3 small, deliberate red X's bled into the paper, marking places she knew from her childhood. The deep woods of the Sheppog River Valley, a forgotten quarry in Haddam, a lonely marsh in the Cockaponsa State Forest. She lifted the first ring to the light and read the engraving, her voice barely a whisper in the sterile air. To Bethany, my endless love, 1973. Bethany Marsh had vanished from a bus stop in Torrington in the autumn of 1977, and her face, frozen in a high school yearbook photo, had haunted a generation of Connecticut investigators. The second ring read Lillian, together always, 1976. Lillian Cross, a nurse from Middletown, had walked out of her night shift at the state hospital in 1981 and was never seen again. The third ring was inscribed simply Evelyn 1975, a name that sent a cold spike through Harlow's memory, because Evelyn Reed, a young secretary from Waterbury, had been the subject of a frantic statewide search in 1980 for that ended in the same crushing silence. The note that had led her here, penned in a spidery hand, echoed in her skull. The ring in the drain was not the first. The hunter was still speaking, and his message was a map of old unmarked graves. The revelation detonated inside the cold case unit like a phosphorus flare. Harlow assembled a task force within 24 hours, drawing in forensic anthropologists from the state medical examiner's office, cadaver dogs from the Hartford Fire Department, and a team of veteran detectives who had cut their teeth on some of the worst unsolved disappearances in New England history. The first excavation took place in a thickly wooded hollow near the Sheppog River, just outside the quiet village of Washington Depot. It was a damp, overcast morning in late November, and the bare branches of the oak tree scratched at a pewter sky as the ground-penetrating radar painted a ghostly outline of disturbed soil 6 feet beneath the leaf litter. The backhoe stopped, and the team switched to trowels and brushes, working with the hushed reverence of archaeologists unearthing a sacred tomb. What emerged from the cold, clay-heavy earth was a skeleton, small and delicate, the bones still clad in the rotted remnants of a wool coat and a nurse's uniform. A silk scarf, its emerald and gold paisley pattern still faintly visible despite decades of decay, was knotted around the cervical vertebrae with a precision that spoke of practiced, ritualistic murder. It was the signature of a man who had killed before and would kill again. The second site, an abandoned trap rock quarry in Haddam, yielded its secret in the slanting light of a December afternoon. The remains of Evelyn Reed were found wrapped in a tarpaulin, her wedding ring missing from her finger, but in the folds of the deteriorated fabric. The forensic team recovered a single crucial fiber, another strand of that same Italian silk. The third grave in the sucking black mud of the Cockaponsa Marsh gave up the bones of Bethany Marsh, her skull bearing the telltale fracture of a violent blow, a deviation from the strangulation pattern that suggested she had fought her attacker with a ferocity that had forced him to abandon his preferred method. In each grave, the absence of a wedding ring was a glaring, echoing void, a void that had been filled by the 3 bands now resting in Harlow's evidence locker. The killer had taken his trophies, and he had kept them for decades in a safe deposit box under the name of a ghost, waiting for the right moment to unveil his monstrous gallery. The forensic laboratory in Meriden became the crucible in which the truth was forged. DNA extracted from the pulp cavities of the victims' teeth was compared to mitochondrial samples from their surviving relatives, confirming their identities with a somber certainty. But the most electrifying discovery came from a single fingernail of Lillian Cross, whose hand had been preserved in the anaerobic clay of the quarry. Under the nail, shielded from the elements for 37 years, was a minute flake of skin, and from that skin, the lab isolated a full male DNA profile. When Harlow ran the profile through the state database, the screen remained stubbornly blank. No match to any known offender. No match to Thomas Carver, whose genetic code was already a matter of record from the Regina Donna prosecution. The man who had murdered these 3 women was a phantom, a figure who had never been arrested, never been swabbed, never left a trace in the digital cathedral of modern law enforcement. And yet he was real, and he had been close enough to the investigation of Regina Donna to plant a wedding ring in a bathroom drain, a ring that had once belonged to the man who would take the fall. It was at this juncture, as the full and horrifying weight of a serial predator's unseen architecture began to press down on every assumption the task force had made, that a quiet interlude found its way into the rhythm of our chronicle. The path we are walking together, through the darkened corridors of long-buried crimes and the slow, painful emergence of justice, is one that demands both patience and attention to the smallest of details. To ensure that you remain a companion on this journey, and that every whispered confession and every rustle of unearthed evidence reaches you with perfect clarity, we invite you to subscribe to the channel and to turn on closed captions for the best possible experience. Now, with that brief pause behind us, we return to the investigation that was about to twist in a direction no one could have foreseen. Harlow began to pull at the threads of the original 1986 case, not as a historical artifact, but as an active crime scene. She reread Arthur Pendleton's investigative notes with a new and terrible suspicion blooming in her chest. Pendleton had been the first detective on the scene at the Victorian on River Road. He had been the one to notice the faint scent of bleach in the upstairs bathroom. He had been the one who traced the emerald and gold paisley scarf to the boutique in New Haven. And he had been the one who cataloged the evidence that sent Thomas Carver to prison. The retired detective was now in his mid-80s, a widower living quietly in a cottage in Niantic, a man whose reputation as a dogged and honorable investigator was beyond reproach. But Harlow had learned, in her years of working cold cases, that the most carefully constructed reputations can hide the most unspeakable secrets. She drove to Niantic on a gray January morning. The Long Island sound a sheet of hammered pewter beyond the salt marshes, and found Pendleton in his small book-lined study, a fire crackling in the grate and a cup of black coffee cooling on the table beside his worn leather chair. He greeted her with the easy warmth of an old mentor welcoming a protege, but his eyes, a pale, watery blue, held a flicker of something that Harlow could only describe as anticipation. She set a digital recorder on the table between them and laid out the photographs of the 3 rings, the map, and the skeletal remains. She told them about the DNA under Lillian Cross's fingernail, the full profile that had no match in the system. And then, with a steadiness that surprised even herself, she produced a small evidence bag containing a coffee cup she had retrieved from the trash can outside his cottage. The DNA from the cup's rim, she told him, had been run against the unknown profile just hours before. The match was a statistical certainty, a 1 in 300 billion lock that chained the man sitting before her to the murder of a nurse who had vanished when Gerald Ford was in the White House. The silence that descended on the room was so profound that Harlow could hear the soft hiss of the logs settling in the fireplace. Pendleton looked at the photographs, then at her, and a slow, peculiar smile spread across his weathered face. It was a smile of relief, of release, the expression of a man who had been holding his breath for half a lifetime and had finally decided to exhale. What followed was a confession that would leave the state of Connecticut reeling. a confession delivered in a calm, measured, almost paternal tone, as if he were explaining a complex case file to a junior detective. Arthur Pendleton admitted to the murders of Bethany Marsh in 1977, Lillian Cross in 1981, and Evelyn Reed in 1984. He had lured each of them with the promise of a rental property or a job opportunity, using aliases and a succession of borrowed cars, and he had strangled them with scarves from the same collection of Italian silk he had purchased at the New Haven boutique in the summer of 1976. The scarves, he said, were his signature, a flourish that connected his work, a secret gallery that only he could curate. The wedding rings he had taken from their fingers were his keepsakes, and the map he had drawn was his private atlas of memory, a document he had never intended to share until the cancer that was now eating away at his pancreas had given him a terminal diagnosis. He wanted his legacy to be known, he said, and he had chosen Harlow as the recipient of his final dreadful gift. But the confession did not stop with the 3 buried women. The most devastating revelation, the one that would shake the foundations of the criminal justice system in Connecticut, concerned the murder of Regina Donnett. Pendleton admitted, with the same unnerving calm, that he had killed her on the evening of October 14th, 1986. He had followed her to the Victorian on River Road, having become fixated on her during the course of a minor traffic stop months earlier. He had entered the house after she had finished her showing, and he had used a scarf from his own private collection to end her life. Then, with the cold, methodical precision of a man who had spent his career studying crime scenes, he had orchestrated the perfect frame. He had stolen Thomas Carver's wedding ring from the men's locker room at the country club 6 weeks earlier, on a hunch that Carver's rumored affair with Regina could be exploited. After killing Regina, he had removed the drain stopper from the bathroom sink and dropped the ring into the pipe, where it lodged in the trap. He had staged the scene, made the anonymous call to the fisherman that led to the discovery of the body, and then inserted himself as the lead investigator, steering every interview, every piece of forensic evidence, and every witness statement toward the man he had chosen to destroy. The silk fiber that had been found under the ring's setting was not a random transfer. Pendleton had placed it there with a pair of tweezers before sealing the evidence bag. The DNA on the ring was Carver's, precisely as he had planned. And the deathbed confession of Margaret Carver, the tape that had sealed her husband's fate in court, was a coerced lie, extracted by Pendleton himself, who had visited the dying woman in the hospital and threatened to implicate her son in the crime if she did not read the script he had prepared. Gerald Finch, the retired officer who had delivered the tape, had been an unwitting pawn, believing Margaret's confession to be genuine because Pendleton, his old friend and colleague, had assured him it was the truth. The arrest of Arthur Pendleton on a bitterly cold morning in February sent a seismic wave through every law enforcement agency in New England. The retired detective, a man who had been awarded the Medal of Valor, who had mentored 2 generations of state troopers, who had been the guest of honor at countless retirement dinners, was let out of his cottage in handcuffs, his face an impassive mask, his eyes fixed on some distant point that only he could see. The news spread through Essex, Old Lyme, and every town along the Connecticut River with the speed of a grass fire. The same community that had gathered in the courtroom to watch Thomas Carver condemned was now forced to confront an almost unthinkable reality. The man they had trusted to find justice for Regina Donnett was the man who had taken her life. The man they had revered as a guardian of the law was a predator who had hunted women across 3 decades, burying them in unmarked graves and keeping their wedding rings as souvenirs. The legal machinery that had convicted Thomas Carver ground into a sudden, frantic reverse. His attorneys, who had been preparing a hopeless appeal based on procedural technicalities, now had a weapon of absolute, unassailable exoneration. The state's attorney's office, reeling from the revelation that their star witness in the original trial had been a serial killer who manipulated the entire prosecution, moved swiftly to vacate Carver's conviction. In a hearing that was broadcast across the country, Thomas Carver, now 77 years old and visibly broken by his years in prison, was led into a Hartford courtroom. His orange jumpsuit replaced by a simple gray suit, his wrists no longer bound by shackles. The judge, her voice shaking with barely contained emotion, apologized on behalf of the state of Connecticut for a miscarriage of justice so profound that it defied comprehension. Carver, who had lost his wife, his fortune, his reputation, and his freedom for a crime he did not commit, said nothing. He simply closed his eyes and let the tears roll down his sunken cheeks. The son of Regina Donnet, Joshua, sat in the gallery, his face a study in anguish, because the man he had believed was his mother's killer, the man he had hated for 32 years, was innocent, and the true monster was a man who had once patted him on the head at a police picnic and told him he would find justice for his mother. Pendleton's own trial was a spectacle of Gothic proportions. He insisted on representing himself, and his cross-examinations of the forensic experts and the detectives who had once been his colleagues were a chilling display of a brilliant, twisted mind still clinging to a sense of control. He called no witnesses in his defense, but instead delivered a closing argument that lasted 4 hours, a rambling, erudite, and deeply disturbing monologue in which he described his murders as works of art, his victims as muses, and his framing of Thomas Carver as a masterpiece of narrative construction. He spoke of the wedding ring in the drain as the central symbol of his life's work, a perfect circle of gold that connected his entire career, the one detail that he had always known would eventually bring his hidden gallery to light. The jury, pale and visibly shaken, took less than 90 minutes to find him guilty on 4 counts of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to 4 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole, and as the bailiffs led him away, he turned to the gallery and offered the same slow, unsettling smile he had given Harlow in his study. It was the smile of a man who had achieved exactly what he had set out to achieve. The final shocking resolution that stunned the community of Essex and the entire state came not in the courtroom, but in the days that followed Pendleton's sentencing. A team of forensic investigators, acting on a cryptic remark Pendleton had made during his confession, returned to his cottage in Niantic with ground-penetrating radar and a warrant to excavate the crawl space beneath the old stone foundation. What they found there would become the stuff of nightmares whispered in the taverns and kitchens of the Connecticut shore for a generation. Beneath a layer of gravel and lime, they uncovered the skeletal remains of 5 more women, each buried with a silk scarf and each missing her wedding ring. The rings were found in a small wooden box in Pendleton's attic, each one engraved with initials and dates that stretched back to 1969. The true tally of Arthur Pendleton's victims was not 4, but 9, and the investigation into the identities of the newly discovered women, some of whom had been missing for so long that their names had faded from all but the most neglected files, was only just beginning. The quiet, tight-knit community that had already endured the shock of Regina Donnet's murder, the wrongful conviction of Thomas Carver, and the unmasking of a serial killer in their midst, now had to face the unbearable truth that the monster had been living among them for his entire adult life, attending their church suppers, investigating their petty crimes, and hiding the evidence of his unspeakable appetites beneath the very floorboards where he slept. And somewhere in the cold, gray walls of the maximum security prison where Arthur Pendleton sat in his cell, sketching maps from memory and humming old hymns, the faint, metallic echo of a wedding band dropping into a drain could be heard by no one but him, a sound that would haunt the dreams of the Connecticut River Valley forever. The door that had swung open in the Litchfield bank vault had led to a hallway far longer and darker than anyone had imagined, and the light at the end of it had not yet been found. The winter of Pendleton's sentencing gave way to a slow, sorrowful spring in the lower Connecticut River Valley in the town of Essex, that postcard-perfect hamlet of clapboard colonials and white steepled churches, found itself grappling with a legacy that no amount of fresh paint or new blossoms could obscure. The 9 victims, whose names were finally released to the public after months of painstaking identification through dental records and DNA, became a somber litany recited in the local papers and whispered in the pews of the Congregational Church. There was Bethany Marsh, the Torrington girl with a shy smile and the dream of becoming a veterinarian. Lillian Cross, the Middletown nurse who had worked double shifts to support her aging mother. Evelyn Reed, the Waterbury secretary who had been planning her wedding when she vanished. And then the 5 whose names had been lost to all but the most dogged missing persons files, names that now took their place in the terrible roll call. Patricia Holloway, a waitress from New London, disappeared in 1969. Diane St. Clair, a librarian from Groton, vanished in 1971. Kathleen O'Mara, a schoolteacher from Norwich, gone in 1973. Suzanne Pike, a college student from Storrs, missing since 1978. And finally, Mary Louise Corbett, a young mother from Old Saybrook, who had walked to the grocery store in 1982 and simply never came home. The map that Pendleton had drawn, with its faded red excess, now led investigators to the crawl space in Niantic, the quarry in Haddam, the Martian Cockaponset, the Shepbog Hollow, and a desolate stretch of woodland in the Mesho-Masick State Forest, where the last 2 victims had been laid to rest in shallow graves that had gone undisturbed for decades. The extended families of these women, some of whom had long ago abandoned hope of ever finding answers, were plunged into a maelstrom of grief that was both fresh and ancient. For Patricia Holloway's younger sister, a woman now in her 70s named Eleanor, the news arrived like a thunderclap on a clear day. She had been 18 when Patricia disappeared, and she had spent the intervening 50 years wondering, imagining, and slowly resigning herself to a void that could never be filled. When Detective Harlow sat with her in the sunlit kitchen of her home in Stonington and told her that Patricia had been found, that she had been murdered by a man who had worn a badge and a pressed uniform, Eleanor's hands began to tremble so violently that her teacup rattled against its saucer. She asked only one question, her voice barely above a whisper. Did she suffer? Harlow, bound by a duty to truth that sometimes felt like a curse, could only say that the medical examiner believed death had been swift. It was a small mercy, a threadbare comfort that Eleanor clutched to her chest as if it were a blanket. In the weeks that followed, she joined a support group that formed spontaneously in the basement of the Essex Library, a gathering of brothers and sisters, nieces and nephews, and elderly parents who had outlived the daughters they had never stopped mourning. They met every Tuesday evening, and the sound of their shared weeping drifted out into the quiet streets, a testament to wounds that time had not healed. The wrongful conviction of Thomas Carver became the subject of legislative hearings in Hartford, and the state of Connecticut, in a rare and painful act of contrition, awarded him a settlement of $18 million, a sum that could never restore the years he had spent in a prison cell, the wife he had lost to cancer while he was incarcerated, or the reputation that had been systematically destroyed by a man he had never met. Carver, broken in body and spirit, used a portion of the money to establish a foundation in the name of Regina Donnet, a non-profit organization dedicated to providing legal assistance to wrongfully convicted individuals. He rarely appeared in public, but on the day the foundation was announced, he stood before a small gathering of reporters in a park overlooking the Connecticut River, the same park where the memorial bench for Regina Donnet had been installed. His voice was thin and reedy, his posture stooped, but his words carried a weight that silenced even the most jaded journalists. He spoke of the years he had spent hating the man he believed had killed the woman he had, in his own flawed way, truly cared for. He spoke of the shock of learning that the real killer had been the man who had arrested him, interrogated him, and testified against him with the calm authority of a public servant. And then he spoke of forgiveness, not for Arthur Pendleton, but for himself, for the anger that had nearly consumed him, for the bitterness that had poisoned his last years with his wife, and for the guilt he had carried over Regina's death, a guilt that had never been his to bear. He sat down on the bench that bore her name, and he wept without shame, an old man finally allowed to grieve. The town of Essex itself underwent a transformation that was at once painful and cathartic. The Victorian on River Road, the house where the wedding ring had been found in the drain, was quietly purchased by a preservation trust and converted into a small museum dedicated to the history of the Connecticut River Valley, with a single room set aside as a memorial to the 9 victims and to Regina Donnet. Visitors who walked through the upstairs bathroom, now restored to its 1880s elegance, often paused and looked at the pedestal sink, unaware that the original plumbing, the very trap that had held its secret for 32 years, had been removed and stored in the state's evidence archive, a silent artifact of an unthinkable crime. The Essex Police Department, which had been led for a time by an officer who had trained under Pendleton, underwent a sweeping internal review, and every unsolved case from the decades of his service was reopened and scrutinized for signs of his hidden hand. The review found no additional victims, but it did uncover a pattern of subtle interference. Cases where Pendleton had steered investigations away from certain suspects or had mishandled evidence in ways that now seemed deliberate. The department issued a formal apology to the families of the victims and to the community at large, an apology that was met with a mixture of gratitude and a deep, abiding weariness. The younger generation of Essex and the surrounding towns, the grandchildren and great-grandchildren of the people who had lived through the original terror, absorbed this history with a kind of stunned incredulity. They had grown up in a world of instant information, of true crime podcasts and streaming documentaries, and the idea that a serial killer could operate undetected for decades in their own backyard, wearing the uniform of a state trooper, seemed like a plot from a grim cable drama, not a chapter from the actual past. In the high school social studies classes, teachers began to incorporate the Pendleton case into their curriculum, not as a lurid diversion, but as a sobering lesson in the fragility of justice. The students learned about the 9 women, about Regina Donnet, about the wedding ring in the drain, and about the innocent man who had spent years in prison because the system had trusted the wrong person. They wrote essays about the nature of evil, about the importance of skepticism, and about the long, slow arc of accountability. One student, a 16-year-old girl named Chloe, who had grown up sailing on the river and riding her bike past the very Victorian where Regina had died, stood before her class and read a reflection that left the room in a profound and respectful silence. She spoke of how the case had taught her that monsters do not always look like monsters, that they do not skulk in shadows or lurk in alleyways, but sometimes shake your hand at a town picnic and ask about your grandmother. She spoke of the importance of listening to the quiet voices, the women who had been dismissed, the families who had been ignored, the evidence that had been overlooked because it did not fit the convenient narrative. And she spoke of the duty that her generation now carried, the duty to remember the names of the 9 women and to ensure that the systems designed to protect the innocent were never again corrupted by the very people sworn to uphold them. The extended family of Regina Donnet, particularly her son Joshua, became the quiet, dignified center of the community's long process of healing. Joshua, who had spent his entire adult life defined by the absence of his mother, found himself suddenly thrust into a role he had never sought, that of a public symbol of both loss and resilience. He gave interviews to the Hartford Courant and the New York Times, speaking with a measured eloquence about the complicated emotions that accompanied the resolution of the case. He expressed no hatred for Arthur Pendleton, a fact that many found difficult to comprehend. Instead, he spoke of a profound exhaustion, a weariness that had settled into his bones after so many years of uncertainty and rage. He had hated Thomas Carver, and that hatred had been misplaced. He had trusted the system, and that trust had been betrayed. He had hoped for closure, and what he had received was something far more complex, a tangled knot of relief, sorrow, and a strange, hollow peace. He established a small scholarship fund in his mother's name at a local community college, awarded each year to a young woman pursuing a degree in social work or criminal justice, a living legacy that would outlast the headlines and the courtroom dramas. On the anniversary of his mother's death, he walked alone to the memorial bench in the riverfront park and sat watching the water. The same water that had carried her body into the reeds. And he allowed himself, for the first time in 32 years, to remember her not as a victim, but as the woman who had sung Joni Mitchell songs in the car and taught him to skip stones. But the deepest and most lasting impact of the Pendleton revelations unfolded in the quiet, private spaces of the community, far from the cameras and the legislative hearings. In the pews of St. John's Episcopal Church in Essex, the Reverend Margaret Holcomb delivered a series of sermons that addressed the spiritual wounds the case had inflicted on her congregation. She spoke of the difference between justice and vengeance, between the law of the state and the law of the heart. She urged her parishioners to resist the temptation to define their town by the crimes of one man, to remember that Essex was also the place where neighbors had brought casseroles to the families of the missing, where volunteers had searched the woods and marshes for any sign of the vanished women, and where the community had, however imperfectly, never stopped caring. The sermons were met with tears, with long silences, and with a slow, tentative return to something resembling faith in the goodness of ordinary people. The children and grandchildren of the victims, many of whom had never known the women whose deaths had shaped their family histories, began to seek out one another, connected by a shared legacy of absence. They formed a group called the Nine Family Circle, meeting 4 times a year in rented halls and church basements, sharing photographs and memories, piecing together the fragments of lives that had been cut short. At one such gathering, held in the community room of the Essex Library on a rainy spring evening, a young woman stood up and introduced herself as the granddaughter of Mary Louise Corbett, the young mother from Old Saybrook. She had never met her grandmother, but she had grown up hearing her mother's stories, and she had carried the weight of that loss without fully understanding it. She said that the resolution of the case had given her something she had never expected to receive, a name for the darkness, a face for the monster, and a place where she could go to mourn. She then read a poem she had written, a simple, heartfelt verse about a wedding ring lost and found, about a map drawn in red ink, and about the long, difficult road from silence to speech. When she finished, the room was so still that the sound of the rain against the windows seemed like a kind of music. And then slowly, the gathered families began to applaud not for the poem, but for the courage it had taken to write it. And now, as we draw this chronicle to its close, we offer a word of gentle counsel to the younger generation who may be listening, those who have inherited a world shaped by the stories we have told. The case of Regina Donnet and the 9 other women whose lives were stolen by Arthur Pendleton is not merely a tale of monsters and heroes, of hidden clues and courtroom drama. It is, at its deepest level, a cautionary fable about the nature of trust. We teach our children to trust the policeman, the teacher, the man in the uniform, and most of the time, that trust is well placed. But the Pendleton case reminds us, with a chill that never quite fades, that trust must always be accompanied by vigilance, that authority must always be questioned, and that the systems we build to protect the innocent are only as strong as the integrity of the individuals who operate them. When a neighbor says that everything is fine, it is not a betrayal of community to look a little closer. When a case is closed too neatly, when an alibi seems too perfect, when a confession arrives too conveniently, the wise citizen pauses and asks the next question. The 9 women whose names we have spoken tonight did not die because they were foolish or careless. They died because a predator wore the mask of a protector, and the community, for too long, saw only the mask. The town of Essex has not forgotten. The memorial bench by the river is never without fresh flowers. The scholarship in Regina Donnet's name receives more applications each year than it can fund. The 9 Family Circle continues to meet, and its membership grows as new generations come of age and seek to understand the shadows that fall across their family trees. Thomas Carver, before he died in 2021, published a short memoir titled The Innocent Man's Burden, and every copy in the Essex Library's collection is dog-eared from constant borrowing. Arthur Pendleton died in his prison cell in 2023, unrepentant to the end. His final words a muttered reference to the wedding ring that had undone him, a symbol that he still regarded with a twisted sort of pride. The Victorian on River Road stands as it always has, its slate roof shedding the rain, its windows reflecting the gray light of the Connecticut sky. And if you stand in the upstairs bathroom on a quiet evening, you can hear the faint, steady drip of water in the pipes, a sound that carries with it the echo of a long-ago October night and a gold band falling into darkness. The river flows on, broad and indifferent, past the ferry landing and the marinas, past the church steeples and the sailboats, carrying its secrets to the sea. And in the hearts of the people who live along its banks, the memory of what was lost and what was found endures, a quiet flame that no amount of time can extinguish. The wedding ring in the drain, that small circle gold, was a key that unlocked not just a single murder, but an entire hidden history of suffering and survival. And its lesson, hard-won and indelible, is this: that the truth, no matter how carefully buried, has a way of finding the light, and that the dead, though they may be silent for decades, are never truly gone. They wait, patient as stone, for someone to listen, to dig, and to remember. The years that followed the resolution of the Pendleton case rolled across the Connecticut River Valley with the slow, measured cadence of the seasons themselves, each spring bringing renewal, each autumn a reminder of the October night when Regina Donnet took her last breath. The town of Essex, that jewel of the shoreline, learned to carry its history without being crushed by it. And in the quiet corners of the community, the work of remembrance continued with a dignity that spoke to the resilience of ordinary people confronting extraordinary darkness. The memorial bench in the riverfront park became something more than a place of mourning. It became a destination, a pilgrimage site for those who had followed the case from afar, and for those who had lived through its every painful twist. On any given afternoon, you might find a visitor sitting there, staring out at the water, tracing with a finger the engraved name of Regina Donnet, and leaving behind a small token, a pebble of flour, a handwritten note that the wind would eventually carry away. The bench faced west, toward the ferry landing where her car had been found, and at sunset, the light on the river turned the color of burnished gold, the same shade as the wedding band that had waited 32 years in the darkness of a drain pipe to speak its terrible truth. The nine-family circle, that remarkable assembly of the bereaved, grew into a permanent institution, a fellowship bound not by blood, but by a shared and unspeakable loss. They lobbied the state legislature for reforms in how missing persons cases were handled, and their efforts led to the passage of a law known as the Connecticut Missing Persons Review Act, which mandated the periodic re-examination of all unsolved disappearances using modern forensic techniques. The law was signed in a quiet ceremony at the state capitol, and several of the family members spoke, their voices steady but their eyes glistening, about the loved ones whose faces still adorned their mantelpieces and whose voices still echoed in their dreams. The act did not promise miracles, but it promised attention, and for families who had spent decades feeling invisible, that attention was a form of justice in its own right. Joshua Donnet, who had been 7 years old when his mother vanished into the rainy October night, became in his middle age a quiet but forceful advocate for the rights of crime victims and their families. He rarely spoke of Arthur Pendleton, and when he did, his words were measured, almost clinical, as if discussing a force of nature rather than a human being. He preferred to speak of his mother, of her laugh and her determination, of the way she would hum while making breakfast, and the way she would always turn around at the door to blow him one last kiss before leaving for a showing. He recorded a series of interviews for the State Historical Society, preserving his memories in a permanent archive, and in those recordings his voice cracked only once, when he described the morning his aunt told him that his mother was not coming home. The scholarship fund that bore Regina's name flourished, and each year, at the award ceremony, Joshua would stand before a room full of bright young faces and tell them that his mother had believed in the power of a fresh start, a second chance, a new key in a new lock. It was, he said, the reason she had become a real estate agent, to help people find the doors they were meant to walk through. The Victorian on River Road, that elegant old house with its complicated past, became a quiet landmark, not of horror, but of history. The Preservation Trust that had assumed ownership maintained it with the reverence to a sacred space, and the small memorial room on the second floor, where the original bathroom had once been, contained photographs of the 9 victims, their names inscribed on a plaque of polished granite. School groups from across the state visited the house, and the docents, many of them retired teachers and librarians, told the story with a gentle frankness that neither sensationalized nor sanitized the truth. They spoke of the wedding ring in the drain as a symbol, a reminder that even the smallest piece of evidence, overlooked or hidden for decades, could bring an entire edifice of lies crashing down. They spoke of the importance of listening to the voices that society too often dismisses. The women whose disappearances were not treated with urgency. The families whose grief was met with indifference. And they spoke of the long, slow arc of accountability, a phrase that had become something of a mantra in the community, a recognition that justice, when it finally arrives, does so at its own pace and in its own time. The younger generation of Essex and the surrounding towns, those who had been children when the case broke open and were now young adults starting families of their own, carried the lessons of the Pendleton case into their lives in ways both subtle and profound. They were, by all accounts, a generation marked by a healthy skepticism, a willingness to question authority without descending into cynicism, a recognition that the institutions designed to protect them were staffed by fallible human beings capable of both great good and terrible evil. The high school social studies curriculum, which had once treated the case as a singular anomaly, now integrated its lessons into broader discussions of ethics, psychology, and the nature of justice. Students debated the question of how a man who had worn a badge and sworn an oath could have committed such atrocities, and in those debates, they grappled with the uncomfortable truth that evil does not announce itself with horns and a forked tail, but often arrives in a pressed uniform, a calm voice, and a reassuring smile. They learned to trust their instincts, to pay attention to the small details that seem out of place, and to speak up when something feels wrong. Even speaking up means challenging a person in authority. And what of the community itself? That small, tight-knit town on the banks of the Connecticut River. It healed, as communities do, slowly and incompletely, with scars that would never fully fade. The Tuesday night support group still met in the basement of the library, though its membership had dwindled as the years passed and the older generation of the bereaved slipped away. The 9 family circle continued to gather, and at their meetings they lit a candle for each of the 9 victims and for Regina Donnet. 10 small flames flickering in the dimness like a constellation of memory. The river flowed on, indifferent to human affairs, carrying its silt and its secrets to the sound, and the ferry continued its slow, reliable crossings, the same crossings that had once been the backdrop for the discovery of a body in the reeds. The town had learned to live with its history not by forgetting it, but by absorbing it into its identity, by acknowledging that even the most beautiful places can harbor the darkest secrets, and that the work of justice is never truly finished. The advice that the older generation now offers to the young, the counsel that has been distilled from decades of grief and revelation, is simple and profound. Pay attention to the quiet voices, the ones that are easy to ignore. Do not assume that a person in a position of trust is worthy of that trust simply because of their title. Understand that the truth, no matter how thoroughly it is buried, no matter how many years pass, has a way of finding the surface, like a gold ring working its way through a pipe, patient and inevitable. And above all, remember the names. Remember Bethany Marsh, Lillian Cross, Evelyn Reed, Patricia Holloway, Diane St. Clair, Kathleen Amara, Suzanne Pike, Mary Louise Corbett, and Regina Donnet. They were daughters, sisters, mothers, and friends. They were women with dreams and plans, with favorite songs and secret hopes, with lives that were stolen by a man who wore a mask of decency and authority. To remember them is to defy the darkness that tried to swallow them. To speak their names is to insist that their lives mattered. And to carry their story forward into the next generation and the one after that is to ensure that the wedding ring in the drain was not just a piece of evidence, but a promise that the truth, no matter how long it takes, will eventually be told. The river, silver and patient, continues its journey to the sea, and on its banks, the town of Essex keeps its vigil, a community that has looked into the abyss and chosen, with quiet courage, to light a candle rather than curse the darkness. Before you go, if you find value and appreciate the story, please consider hitting subscribe and like the video. Turn on notifications too, so you don't miss the next interesting dramatized solved cold case video. We truly appreciate your support. Thanks for listening and watching.